My name is Trevor. I'm Dubsado's product education lead, and today's webinar is another entry in the series of the Dubsado Basics webinar series. And the low lift, high impact workflows is the title of our webinar. And I'd love to talk a little bit about what that really means to me and hopefully give everybody here who's attending an idea of what we're going to be getting into today. So with Dubsado webinars, I hear all the time like some hesitancy to kind of get them built or get going with webinars. And the entire goal of this webinar is to demonstrate that they're a little bit easier to set up than you probably think. And with just a couple of actions, you can actually take your Dubsado brand, your account, from being not automated at all to a lot more automated. And the key is that you don't have to worry about automating everything all at once. That's really what I wanted to hammer home today with this webinar. All the time, I see folks who want to build webinars and they think, okay, well, I have this long process and I have to really think about every nook and cranny of that process and account for every single possibility in order to start automating. And that's really not the case, right? And this is something that I'm guilty of in my day-to-day life is you have something that seems like a big task in front of you and it looks like, man, that's going to be really hard to accomplish that task or that goal. But if you break it into smaller pieces, you'll find success and you'll be able to kind of get going with that. And so the idea with this webinar today is that low lift, meaning that it's not going to take you too much effort to set this up and it's going to have a high impact on your account because it's going to start automating things. We're just going to take your process, a couple of generalized processes that we're going to demo here today and say, okay, cool. We're starting at this point. We're going to automate a couple of steps and you'll see, okay, great. Now I'm automated a little bit more. And down the line, you can always add more to that workflow if you want to. But the idea today is we're going to take three really common places that users find themselves starting. And we're going to automate a workflow from each starting point. We're going to be talking about starting with a lead capture form. We're going to be talking about starting with a scheduler in a lead capture form. We're going to be talking about starting with a public proposal. Those are the three starting places that I want to talk about today as far as beginning a workflow. Now, that's not to say that you couldn't basically make a workflow for the middle or the latter half of your process if you wanted to, and then manually apply that workflow down the line. You totally could do that. But usually when I'm talking to folks about starting to use workflows or starting to use automations, I always ask, okay, great, where does your process start? Which is why we're kind of focusing on the three different scenarios for where someone's process might begin. So kind of like some of our other Dubsado Basics webinars we've done in the past, this is going to be an entirely a live demo. I'm going to be building these workflows in front of you in a test account. And I really encourage everyone who's attending to ask questions in the chat as I'm going, because I'll do my best to keep an eye on the chat and answer them as we go along. And also keep in mind that the workflows that I'm building out today are generalized, right? They're not going to be specific to your business or your industry, but you can easily extrapolate some of the concepts into your own business process for yourself. And of course, if you have questions about your particular process, I'm happy to answer them in the chat. So that's kind of the concept that I want to talk about today. I know I went a little bit more talking on the front end than I typically do, but I wanted to kind of explain the idea here so that folks who are attending have a good idea of what we're getting into. The idea is just to start automating your process at least a little bit. And I think you'll see that once you dip your toe in the water that you're going to want to keep going down the line once you feel comfortable kind of setting up workflows and figuring out where your process starts and kind of getting the first couple of actions in there. That's the idea today. All right, enough talking about just face-to-face here. Let's go ahead and get some demo going. So give me 1 second and I'll go ahead and get that started for everybody. Drag my screen over there. Beautiful. We'll go ahead and do this. Please be the right tab. Oh. Sweet, you can see my mouse. All right, great. Cool. Okay, so I'm here in my test brand, my demo account. And I've got three shells of workflows, the three different workflows we're going to make today. We're going to start with our lead capture flow. Like I said, that's the first one we're going to do. This is probably the simplest or the most basic one that we're going to start with because most folks when they're first getting into Dubsado are like, great, I've built out some forms. I have some project statuses set up, some just pieces of their accounts are built out, and now they want to start automating, right? And so typically speaking, you're like, great, I have my lead capture form and I've put it on my website. And that's kind of where we're starting at with this example is we're going to go ahead and just say, great, we have our lead capture form on the website and I want to start automating a couple steps for after a client fills that form out. And just to reiterate once again, right? We want to think about workflows like a finished jigsaw puzzle, right? doing workflows is going to require you to have some of those puzzle pieces created already. So what I'm working with here in this demo account, I already have my lead capture form created. I already have a scheduler created for later on, right? I have some project statuses created. So we do need to make sure that those pieces exist in our accounts, but don't feel like you need to sit down in one sitting and put together an entire 1,500 piece jigsaw puzzle. We're just doing maybe the top left corner, right? That's the entire idea of this today, is we're going to start building out that puzzle. So with our lead capture flow, let's go ahead and take a look at the form we're actually working with. So I'm just going to go to forms, and over here, I have my website lead capture form, right? If you are brand new to Dubsado, hopefully this isn't too far cry for you to take a look at these forms here. We can talk about this briefly. Let's see why this isn't loading. Give it 1 second. There we go. So lead capture form, right? Just a really quick review, right? We want to make sure we're capturing the first name, last name, and email at minimum of our clients, right? And obviously I can ask as many other questions as I want to. In this particular case, I have this lead capture form built out as, or this brand really built out for a web design company, right? So that's kind of the other questions I'm asking here. And the idea being that I'm going to take this lead capture form and I could go to the sharing button and I could embed this lead capture form on my website if I want to, during new leads as they come in, right? As people are finding my websites and filling out this interest form. And so we're going to come back to the form settings here once we're done with this workflow. But the idea is once I'm finished with that lead flow, I'm going to come back to this default workflow area and grab that workflow to apply, which would be my lead capture flow, right? So we'll do that at the end, since typically speaking, I wouldn't recommend connecting your workflow until you're like, cool, I've built out the pieces that I wanted to do, and then you go ahead and plug it in. But I just want to remind everybody, that's something that I've seen folks do before too. They take some time and build out a workflow, and then they're all excited and they forgot to link it to their work, to their lead capture form rather. So we want to make sure we don't forget that. That's why we're talking about it right now. So starting with this lead capture form, really commonly, right, what folks will do, like what folks will want to have happen after somebody fills out the lead capture form is they'll be like, great, somebody expressed interest in my business and I actually want to talk to them now. So the most common thing that folks will first want to do is to send that client, that new potential lead, an appointment scheduler. So let's go ahead and start setting that up in the workflow. So let's go back to our workflows area. And we're going to go into our lead capture flow, and we're going to go ahead and click the gear icon. And again, in case you're confused, if you're brand new to Dubsado, I pre-built out just the shells of these workflows. So if you're, in your accounts and you're like, I don't have a lead capture flow, that's totally fine. You can always go back into workflows and click add workflow and then title it as such. But to make sure that was clear for everyone. So in my lead capture flow, we're going to go ahead and just click add action. And let's go ahead and break down what this modal here that we're seeing is for anybody who's brand new to workflows. So what we're seeing right now after we click add action, this is kind of the default modal that will appear to let you start building the action that you're talking about, right? The entire idea with the workflow is that you're going to start telling the system all the different variables that it needs to take into account for that given action. So at the very top here, we're going to tell it what action we want to take. Now, if I click this dropdown, we're going to go ahead and pick from a list of different actions. I want to make sure you guys can see that drop down. Let's wait for it to load in here. Hopefully, let me know if you guys can see my mouse in this drop down real quick. I want to make sure you guys can see the different actions. I feel like it's probably not showing. I wonder if I can share my entire window so it does show. Angel or Christy, since you guys, Carmen says no. Okay, great, cool. Give me 1 second. Let's see if I can actually get it to show that real quick, since that's going to be helpful for us. 1 second, folks. Let's do that, and then let's do this. Okay. How about now? Let's see here. Click that drop down. That's frustrating. Let's try this instead. Sorry, folks, give me 1 second. There we go. Okay. Thanks for bearing with me there, folks. I didn't realize it wasn't going to show that. There we go. Now everyone can see that. Perfect. So starting over from the top there, we're looking right now at this action dropdown. And really what I wanted to show you is the options that we can see here in this dropdown. That's going to be helpful for obviously other places where we have dropdowns as well. Perfect. Thanks, Christy. Sweet. So again, just to reiterate, we're We're going to click add action. And then this is the modal that's going to pop up anytime you click a new action. You're adding a new action, right? As you can see, we've got a ton of different actions we can pick from, and I don't want new users to get daunted by the number of different things you can actually select here. Something that we always say here at Dubsado that's helpful for when you're picking your action is to think about what you are sending to the client. So in this case, like I mentioned, if we have our lead capture formats on our website, and the first thing we want to have happen is that we're inviting that new lead to schedule an appointment with us, we think, okay, great. They need to be sent something that's going to let them book an appointment with me. In Dubsado, that's an appointment scheduler. So in this case, right, we're going to pick send appointment scheduler. Now, you might also be looking at this dropdown list and going, well, hang on, like I know I'm sending them an email, so I might pick send email, right? Because that's the primary mode of communication here in Dubsado. But what I like to add on to what I was just saying is that think about specifically what you're attaching to that email. In this case, we're sending them an email, sure, but we're also sending something that's going to allow them to book an appointment, right? In that case, the appointment scheduler is kind of the attachment, so to speak. A really great way to think about this is outside of Dubsado, maybe you are just sending an email, maybe in Gmail to a client, right? You type up your email, and then at the end, you click that little paperclip icon to maybe add a PDF, right? That PDF being the attachment that you're talking about. In Dubsado, think about whatever the content is that you're sending as the attachment, and that's going to help you pick the action appropriately. In this case, we're going to say, yeah, I want to send an email, but the attachment really is the appointment scheduler. So we're going to say send appointment scheduler. Same thing is true if I wanted to send a form, right? It is still an email, but I'm specifically sending a form. So I'm going to pick send form. It's really going to just come down to what that attachment is. And if I were to pick send email, all that's really looking for in a workflow action is just looking for plain text. Of course, you could include hyperlinks to external content, but if I'm including any kind of Dubsado content, there's going to be a specific action here in this dropdown for that content. I want to make sure that that was clear. And if you have questions about that, please let me know. Carmen had a question, said, what about if your scheduler is on your website? Carmen, great question. We are going to be doing that particular flow right after the lead capture flow. So stay tuned. We're going to get to that one right after this, but we're definitely going to talk about that. Okay, Carmen? Cool. So we're going to go ahead and say send appointment scheduler, and that's going to pull up a bunch of different options, right? Like I said, the entire idea of this workflow modal, this long kind of pop-up page that we see here, is just filling in variables for the system to go ahead and automate this effectively, right? So now that we've got our action picked, we can talk about this when setting is the next thing I would go. We're just going to go down the list. So by default, the timing of this action or the when setting is going to be set to 0 days after our previous action is completed. That is synonymous with immediately, right? Since especially given that this is the first action in this workflow, there are no previous actions just yet. So that means that as soon as this workflow gets started, it's going to send this action right away. Now, at the beginning of a workflow, you could also pick after workflow started. In this case, right, that's going to be doing exactly the same thing. There's no right or wrong answer here, but since this is the default after our previous actions, that's usually what I leave it on since I want it to go out immediately, right? As soon as somebody fills out that lead capture form on my website, I want them to receive an email with the ability to go ahead and book an appointment with me. Of course, if you wanted to add a delay in there, and I see this pretty frequently, so that it doesn't feel quite so robotic, you could always say, 1 hour, for example. Maybe you want there to be a delay. That way it feels more like the system, sent them that email an hour later. The client might think, oh, the person actually already read my response and is emailing me right now, and we're doing this automatically, right? So it depends on your preference. There's no right or wrong way to do it, but most commonly I see just 0 days or 0 hours, anything like that, for after our previous action is completed to go ahead and send that action immediately. So moving on from there, we're going to go ahead and look at these send scheduler options. We're not going to play with this one too much right now, but by default, we have send email and apply to portal. I know some of you might be thinking, well, he hasn't mentioned the portal at all just yet. And I maybe am aware that Dubsado has a client portal, but do I need to worry about that? For right now, we can just go ahead and ignore this setting because we do want to send an email to the clients. And just so you're aware, by default, whenever I send clients Dubsado content, it will also end up in their client portal. Whether or not you use it, right, it will be there. So the fact we're not worrying about the portal right now, we're not going to talk about the portal too much at all today, but it will just be in their portal by default. If later on you decide, hey, I want to use the client portal, just know that anything you've emailed to them will by default be added to the portal too. So there's that piece. We're going to skip over this require approval before completing this action step because for right now, it's not relevant, right? We don't need to approve this action before it goes out, but in one of our flows later on, we will use this option. So we'll come back to that in a little bit. The biggest things to think about when you're setting up a workflow action are really what action we're choosing, this when setting. And then lastly, we got to make sure we tell the system what specific content to send, which is the next thing on our list here, this scheduler template to send. So I'm telling the system to go ahead and send an appointment scheduler, but I might have more than one scheduler template, right? So I'm going to tell the system, cool, I want to go ahead and send my discovery call scheduler template. So I have to tell the system which one to send to them, right? Now, lastly, we could go ahead and choose an email to send. And this is helpful if you've already done a lot of your homework in Dubsado, which is building out maybe some of your canned emails. If you have some wording that you know you want to use whenever a client inquires with you and you want to invite them to go ahead and book an appointment with you, you could go ahead and pick it from this dropdown right here, and it would automatically populate into this email body. For right now, I'm just going to leave it on the default since functionally speaking, right, it doesn't really matter what this email says. All that really matters is that you pay attention to this line right below this right here. And this is something to always keep an eye out for, which says, make sure this template includes the scheduler link variable. And in other cases, it's going to say like if it was a form, it would say the form link variable, but it's always going to highlight in red the smart field that it knows you need to have in the body of your email. If you're not familiar with smart fields, real quickly, a smart field is essentially just a little chunk of code that acts as a placeholder for your content that you're sending in Dubsado. In this case, it looks kind of like gobbledygook, right? It's brackets, scheduler, and then bar scheduler link. You're like, I don't know what that means. Just know that this little chunk of code is going to tell the system, hey, I want a link to this particular scheduler template to appear right there in the email. It's essentially putting that in that spot in the email. If that scheduler template link does not exist and you don't have it in your email, then when you send the email to the clients, it won't have a link for them to go ahead and click through and book that appointment. So it's imperative that whatever whatever smart field appears in red here, it's imperative that it appears in the body of your email. So we want to make sure that that's there, okay? Like I said, in other cases, and we'll see this later on, it's going to be a different smart field, but the default email will always have it in there. So it's just something to keep an eye out for. If you pick a different canned email, you want to make sure that that link's in there. If your canned email doesn't have that smart field, that's totally okay. You can always add it into your email by clicking smart field. And then over here on the right, we have link. And these are going to be all the different kinds of smart field content links that we can use. Any questions so far? I know I went through kind of a lot of information in this one modal, but I think it's important that we kind of get our ground rules established for setting up workflow actions, because after we kind of understand the ins and outs of how to do one action, it's going to be a little bit quicker to kind of do the rest, right? Like I said, we're breaking down the process of, hey, this mountain of automation, I need to have this whole process that I want to automate, and we're breaking it into small chunks, digestible chunks. That way, once you're accustomed to one thing, you can kind of expand your confidence from there, and I think you'll be automating things really well before you know it. So let me know if there's any questions in the chat about that before I move on. Okay. Okay, looking good. So now that we have kind of gone through all the settings in this workflow action, we can go ahead and just say apply, right? Now we've got our first action, and now it's automated, right? Obviously, we haven't connected our workflow to lead capture form just yet, but let's move on for a couple more steps. So now, just to kind of review, we have our lead capture form on our website. When a client inquires, it's going to send them an email with a discovery call scheduler link in that email. That's the first thing that we want to have happen. Now, maybe after they receive that email, we want to keep track of whether or not they've actually booked an appointment. And so we can definitely do that in the workflow. So, pardon me. We're going to go ahead and click add action once again. Now this time, if I'm trying to keep track of a client's progress through my process, you might be wondering, okay, how do we do that? And if you've set up some project statuses in your main projects page, this is a great way to go ahead and keep track of somebody moving through your flow. So under the action dropdown, this time I'm going to go ahead and say change project status, because now I want to keep track of if they have or haven't booked that appointment, right? So change project status, and then when. Now this setting, we are going to change this from the default. We don't necessarily want this to happen immediately, which is what 0 days after our previous actions would be. This time we want it to do it specifically when they book, right? So if I click this dropdown, we've got a whole bunch of what these are called triggers, right? We've got a whole bunch of triggers to go ahead and time this action to happen at specifically the right moment in time. And so now we can go ahead and say, great, well, I want to time it after they book. So let's see here. What would I pick? Maybe after an appointment is scheduled, right? If I pick after an appointment is scheduled, a new setting pops up here. Now we have scheduler/group to watch. So once I pick after an appointment is scheduled, we can go ahead and tell the system to watch for someone to book an appointment after that discovery call has been sent to them, right? Now, this only works if you send your scheduler in the workflow. And since we have right here, if you can kind of see behind the modal, this send appointment scheduler, now that we've sent that scheduler, the workflow can watch for that scheduler to be booked essentially, which is exactly what we want to have happen. And the last thing on this particular modal is we're going to go ahead and say, great. As soon as they book, I want that project to be put into the discovery call booked setting. And that's all I would need to do. So that way, once they book, it's going to automatically move that project into the discovery call booked project status. And anybody who's in that status has booked a discovery call with you, which is a really handy way to kind of keep track of your projects at a glance. Now, you may have seen, right? I also have in here a discovery call sent scheduler, discovery call sent project status, right? So I could even go one step further and add in another one of these change project status actions before or right after this particular appointment scheduler is sent to keep track of when they have sent it, but I've gone ahead and sent it out. And then I can keep track of when they've booked. So you can go take that concept as far as you want. You can have as many project statuses that you want and as many change project statuses in your workflow as you want. It's entirely up to you. But again, we're just keeping this nice and straightforward and simple for the purposes of demonstration, but sky's the limit as far as automation is concerned. We're just concerned with kind of getting ourselves off the ground here, okay? So we're gonna go ahead and leave that on discovery call booked and say apply. And now lastly, we wanna go ahead and essentially wait for that appointment to be done, because the idea here, and this is all hypothetical, right? It's going to be different depending on your business process, is maybe I go ahead and have that appointment with the clients. I talk to them about their needs and they're like, great, I want to move forward with you. And as soon as they say yes on that call, you're like, fantastic, I'll go ahead and send you my proposal right after we get off the call here, and we can use the workflow to time that out. So we're going to go ahead and say add action one more time. And now under this dropdown, like I mentioned before, we are sending the client an email, but we're sending an email with what I would call an attachment, right? And that's going to be our proposal in this case, proposal being a Dubsado form. So we're going to choose the send form option and not send email. Send email, again, is just looking for plain text or hyperlinks to outside non-Dubsado content. Send form is specifically looking for, hey, we're going to send a Dubsado form to this client in an email. All right. So we're going to choose send form. And again, we've got all these options that pop up again for us really nicely. And now under this when setting, again, we can time this out really specifically, right? The idea being, I don't want to send that proposal to the clients until at least after that appointment is done, because I need to talk to the clients to understand what their needs are for, working with me. So I know I don't want it to go out immediately, which is 0 days after our previous actions. So instead of doing that, I can click this triggers dropdown and I can look for after an appointment has ended. So it's gonna be able to say, great, tell me what scheduler we're watching for that appointment to end. We can go ahead and click the drop down. And again, I can choose the discovery call. So you can see once we start adding things into the workflow, things start lining up really nicely, right? Because it's all looking at the previous things we've sent. We can time things out really well. And in just 3 steps, we're going all the way from a client finding you on your website to you sending out a proposal, all relatively automated with one exception. We'll talk about that right now. So we're looking for when this appointment ends. We're looking at that discovery call. But let's remember, right? In the real world, not every single client that you talk to on a discovery call is going to want to book with you. I mean, that's just kind of the nature of being a small business, right? The nature of the game is that sometimes folks go, oh, thank you so much for your time, but I'm still thinking about it, or they want to move in a different direction. So maybe we don't want this email to go out to them automatically when that appointment ends, because they might have said no, right? To account for that, we can actually check this box right here. It says require approval before completing this action. So it's still going to be automated to the point where it's not going to prompt you to send this email until after the appointment is done. But you as the business owner still have the human element of being like, I know that the client loved my business process and loved everything about it. They want to move forward. I'm going to click approve to send that email. Or you go, you know what? That client needs a little bit more time to think. I'm going to wait to send this proposal, or I'm just not going to send it at all. And the approval button is going to let us make that choice ourselves, right? The only manual part of this particular workflow is that approval button, which is really nice to give us that option. Christy asks, what if you need to add an attachment to an automated email? If we require approval, will that allow us to add something to the email before it sends? Christy, great question. So depending on what kind of attachment you want to send, there's going to be a couple different ways to do that. But the kind of core of your question is exactly correct, actually, which is that if you do require approval, it will allow you to edit the email before it goes out, which a lot of folks use approvals on almost everything they have in a workflow, right? Because they want to add maybe a bespoke touch or have the opportunity to customize and edit an email before a workflow sends it out. But the nice thing about doing that in a workflow is that it's already templated out. It's already all there for you, and your whole flow is there. with approvals on there, and you can just go ahead and tweak an email, click approve, tweak an email, click approve. It takes away all of that admin work of like, I need to type an entire email right now. It can really help you out. So to answer your question, Christy, yes, essentially, you can definitely do that. Link a Google Drive link? Totally. Yeah, I'll show you how to do that right now, Christy. So moving on, right? Let's say I wanted to send a proposal, same thing that we're doing already, right? Again, like I mentioned before, oops, I didn't mean to do that, sorry. Like I said before, we want to make sure that we have this smart field in the body of our email, the form link smart field now. And again, by default, it's going to be there. If you choose a different email, make sure it's in there somewhere. But now let's say you wanted to also add in that Google Drive link. Super straightforward, Christy. All I would do is let's go ahead and say I wanted to add that link right here. I can click the A formatting options button here. And then on the right-hand side, I can go ahead and say insert link or button. And I could choose to be a hyperlink or even a button. Let's just say it was a button, right? Just for fun. And then you would throw in your Google Drive link right here. We could say Google Drive for the title of that button. And we can go ahead and say open a new tab and say insert. And now I've gone ahead and added in that link. So super straightforward to go ahead and add in external content to this email in addition to your proposal, even if you wanted to, right? And again, if I have require approval on this action, it will not send unless you physically go into the workflow in the project and click approve, giving you time to add that link if you want to, Christy. Sweet. Cool. Glad that was helpful. All right. Moving right along here. I know I'm going a little bit slow, but the other ones we'll pick up the pace just a touch because, like I said, we want to make sure we understand some of these base concepts. So before I move on, actually, I did skip over this piece here, which again, as you can see, if you manage to forget one of those options, it'll be grayed out. It'll be like, hey, system's like, I don't know what form you want me to send, so I can't let you apply this just yet. So some safeguards in there for you. But anyways, the base concept here was that we want to go ahead and send a proposal after the client has that discovery call. So great, I'm going to click into this dropdown and I'm going to scroll through, or I could even type into this add new form and search for it if you have a lot of forms. We can go ahead and say, fantastic, 3Dubs design package proposal. Now that I've told the system what action we're doing, we're sending a form. I've told it when to send that, which is after the appointment ends. I've told it to watch for particular appointments. I've even added an approval. And lastly, I've told it what form to send. Now we can go ahead and say apply. And that's how it kind of shows up here in this workflow builder mode. It's going to look slightly differently once you see this workflow applied to a project, because keep in mind, right, what I'm editing right now is our workflow template, or like sometimes I call it a master template. And when we're actually in a project, you'll see all the same actions and you'll see this approve button, but you'll see a couple of extra options here on the right-hand side after each action. Things like mark is completed or force now. We can talk a bit more about that later if we actually show this in a project, but I just wanted to call out to you guys that this is going to be slightly different looking in a project, but the entire bones of it are all going to be the same. But that's kind of the entire way through our lead capture flow, our first example here today that I wanted to show you. We're going all the way from, like I said, websites through sending a proposal. And then from there, right, you're like, fantastic. I had all those things kind of automated. I was keeping track of the client as they either booked or didn't book. And now from when they fill out that proposal, you can maybe handle that manually if you want to, or once you feel comfortable with this flow, you could always add additional actions. There's no barrier or no cap on the number of actions you can have in a workflow. And man, I have seen some long workflows and there's nothing wrong with that at all, as long as you feel confident in your flow here. But the idea that I'm getting across is that with just 3 actions, we went all the way from somebody who doesn't know your business at all, find your website, to now we've automated them to receiving your proposal. So 3 actions is all you needed, and having that content already built out means we can automate that really easily. And hopefully if you are somebody who just has a lead capture form on your website, this is helpful for you, because it can be a really high impact workflow with a pretty minimal amount of work, so long as you followed along with me here. Any questions about starting with the lead capture form before I move into starting with a scheduler in a lead capture form, which I know Carmen was asking about earlier? Let me know in the chat. We'll give it just a second to see if there's any questions about this flow. Looking good, looking good. Okay, sweet. Let's go ahead and move on to our next example. So like I said, our next example is going to be starting with a scheduler with an attached lead capture form. You might be wondering, well, okay, I'm starting with a scheduler, but why do I also need a lead capture form? And we're going to talk about that. So if I go back to my workflow, what I'm talking about is this particular one right here. Why is this not? There we go. Okay. So scheduler with lead capture form flow. So if I have a scheduler embedded on my website, let's go ahead and take a look at my schedulers real quick. Maybe I have my, let's see here, my website discovery call. This is the one that's embedded on my website. And just as a review, if you're unfamiliar with this, right? Let's say you built out a scheduler and you're like, man, I would love to have this on my website, but how do I do that? It's a really small button, so it's kind of easy to miss, is right here, this copy link button. It's gonna be right next to the copy templates and right next to the trash can. So make sure we're clicking that middle one for copy link. If I click that, it's going to give us the iframe code, which we can use to embed this on the website, or you can always just use the direct link, which is helpful for like, hey, if you have an Instagram bio and you want folks to be able to book an appointment with you from finding your Instagram, that can be useful there too. Either way, we're starting with the scheduler. And again, like I mentioned kind of at the very beginning, is the workflows are going to change depending on where you start if we're trying to automate things from the beginning. So if you're someone who's like this, I know many of our users are in this boat where they're starting with the scheduler. This is going to be the flow for you. So if we're starting with this website discovery call, let's take a look at our advanced settings in our scheduler, because this is going to help us and be necessary to start this process automatically. So under the advanced settings, we can scroll down a little ways, and we're going to ignore all of the settings of the scheduler for the time being. We're just going to assume that you've set it up to your liking, with the exception of one setting here, which is the additional form setting. Now, just as a review, if you have a scheduler embedded on your websites, that means that it's not in the context of any existing Dubsado project, right? Anybody on the internet can find your scheduler and book an appointment with you. Since the clients in this case could be literally anyone, we need to or want to keep track of who the person is that's booking with you. Now, if I don't include an additional form, that's okay. You can do that and have a scheduler posted on your website with nothing additional on the form slot here. But keep in mind that even if you don't have an additional form that you've elected to put there, the scheduler will always have what I call the default scheduler form displayed to the client at some point in that process. So that way it collects their first name, their last name, and their email, because the system has to know who is booking this appointment, right? It'd be a bit alarming if you opened your laptop one morning and sat down and looked at your calendar and you're like, man, I have 3 new appointments next week, but I don't know who it's with. So we definitely don't want a situation like that. The system is going to collect that information, whether you add a form or not. In this case, we want to add a lead capture form because the lead capture form is specifically what's going to let us start a workflow. And again, right, we showed that at the very beginning with the lead capture form flow. We have to tell that lead capture form which workflow to start. Carmen's asking if you can add 2 forms. Really good question, Carmen. In this case, no, we actually cannot add a second form to the scheduler, but we could certainly attach or add a form to the workflow that's going to happen later on. And that's actually the exact flow that I was going to demonstrate for you all here. Just to give you a bit of a heads up or a sneak peek, right? We're starting with the scheduler that has a lead capture form, and then we're going to send a follow-up intake questionnaire right off the bat, because you probably just want to have that first lead capture form be really simple, simplistic, right? Just first name, last name, maybe a couple questions in there. And then later on, once you've kind of gotten them booked, you've gotten them in the door, you might need more information from them. And so this is the flow that we're going to build out there. Pardon me. Yeah, Carmen. So exactly what you said, a lead capture form and a pre-call questionnaire. That's actually exactly what we're doing today. So unfortunately, we can't add 2 forms to this flow, but it might actually be beneficial to not add 2 forms here, because we want the barrier to book to be as low as possible. Keeping in mind, and again, this is something important to know if you're brand new to Dubsado, is that whatever form I add in this additional form slot here, whoever's filling out that scheduler, they have to fill out the form in its entirety in order to actually book. If I was to go ahead and let me just show you an example real quick. Take this direct link and open it in a new tab. Let's say I found this scheduler on someone's website, right? And I picked Friday at 9, right? And I say submit next. If I don't fill this form out, my appointment is not booked. And so it's important, right, that the form you attach is, in your opinion, feasible for someone to fill out relatively quickly, because if they get disinterested or they kind of lose their place and something happens in real life and they have to walk away from it, if they don't finish this form, they're not going to be booked. So it's important to keep your form short if you're going to be attaching a lead cap or any kind of form, really, for that matter, to your scheduler, because we want to make sure we get those folks to book. In my opinion, right, the form I have here, this is just the same lead capture form we're already working with. If it was me, I'd probably make this even shorter. I'd probably remove some of these extra questions and throw it onto a pre-call questionnaire like Carmen was asking. Cool. Okay. So not to get too far into the weeds there, but the entire idea is we're starting with a scheduler, and we're starting with specifically with a scheduler that has a lead capture form in the additional forms area right here, because that's going to allow us to kick off that workflow. And again, right, if I go back to forms here, under the website lead capture form, I'd want to make sure to come back to the form settings and plug in my scheduler flow, scheduler lead capture flow, once I'm done building this. And again, obviously I moved on to the next example, but I didn't remember to come back and plug in my lead flow before I finished or after I finished it. So like I said, it can be easy to forget. So once you're done building your flow, make sure you go back to wherever your process starts to plug in that particular workflow. You might also be wondering, hey, this is the exact same lead capture form you were talking about, but you can only have one workflow here. If it was me and I wanted to have both of those flows running simultaneously, I could duplicate this form and have one be just the lead capture form by itself, and the second one could be for the scheduler. That way you could have two different workflows running kind of simultaneously, depending on where that client finds you. I digress. Probably too complicated or too into the weeds for one webinar at a time, but just to kind of give you an idea if you were wondering that. Anyhow, let's go ahead and start building out that workflow now that we've kind of got our ground rules established. So in this particular case, we're going to click the gear icon like we just always do, and we're going to say add an action. And just like Carmen was asking, right? So let's say I had a really short lead capture form that I need them to fill out when they actually go ahead and book that appointment, but I need more information for them once they were actually booked, right? That just short form, that preliminary form is not going to cut it as far as the info that I, the business owner, need to go to that call prepared, right? So in this case, we're going to go ahead and say action. We're going to say send form. And again, under the when setting, we're going to leave this. I believe probably the best way to do this would be immediately. You could also do the same thing that I said before, which is like 1 hour if you wanted to, but we'll leave it on immediately, 0 days after all previous actions. And we're going to go ahead under the form template to send. I'm going to pick my questionnaire that I've already built out, right? Which is right here, web design intake form. So I could, supplemental intake form, whatever your title is going to be fine. But this, whatever form you pick here, this is the form that's going to have longer form questions on there, so you can actually be prepared for your call. So say website design intake form. And then we're going to go ahead and just leave the rest of this the way it is by default. So like I said, the only thing that's really important if you're picking a different email is to make sure you double check the smart field that's highlighted in red and make sure it appears somewhere in the body of your email. That way there's a link that displays for that content you're sending them, which in this case is that questionnaire. And that's it for the first action. We're going to go ahead and say apply. So to review, what the client's going to see on their end is they're going to find your website. They're going to go ahead and pick a date and time, and they're going to fill out your lead capture form. And as soon as they do that, they have booked an appointment and they've given you a little bit of information. And now the workflow will kick into gear and send them this website design intake form to ask them for more information. That's the idea here. Now, what do we want to do after that? That's a good question. And there's a couple different ways you could go from here. But let's go ahead and keep in mind that with the scheduler, you actually cannot include a contract. And that's something that we are working on internally here for hopefully in the future, because we know that there's some demand there for folks like, hey, I want somebody to be able to book an appointment and I want them to be able to sign a contract right off the bat to really jumpstart that flow. Really helpful for folks like photographers and stuff like that, right? Since right now, there's no way to do that in the scheduler just by itself, we can totally do that in the workflow just as easily. So we're gonna go ahead and say add an action. And we're going to go ahead and this time, right, a new action that we're going to use here today is send contract, right? Same kind of logic applies. We're sending them an email, but that email is going to include the contract that I want them to sign. And so in this case, we're not picking send email, we're picking send contract, right? Let's go ahead and do that. Now, pick send contract, and then now this when setting, let's talk a little bit about that. Now, if I click into this drop down here and I wanted to go, okay, great, I want this to be sent after the appointment that they booked, right? You might pick one of these after an appointment is scheduled, after appointment start time, or after appointment is ended. But there's a little bit of a bugaboo here, which is that these options won't work in this context. As you might notice here, the only thing in this workflow is we're sending a form. We're not sending any appointment schedulers. That scheduler that we were talking about was started outside of your workflow, right? It was before the workflow kicked off, essentially, that they booked that call. So there's not going to be any way for this workflow to watch for when that appointment starts, when it ends, that kind of thing. If you wanted to watch when an appointment specifically started or ended, you would want to do that first flow, which is start the lead capture form instead and send the scheduler afterwards. And this is a conversation I have with users very frequently because it depends on what your flow is, if you need to be that specific with the timing or not. In this case, this can be a little bit less specific on the timing, but that's totally okay. We're going to leave this on 0 days after our previous actions, but we're going to go ahead and say require approval. And it's the same logic that we talked about before, which is like, hey, I want to wait for that discovery call to occur. And that way I know if the client is the real deal and they want to work with me or not. And it gives you the opportunity to not send the contracts in the case of the client says, you know what, no, thank you, I'm okay. So we're going to go ahead and say require approval. And then lastly, just the same way we did before, right? Now that we're sending a contract, we have to tell the system what kind of contract or which contract to send. So now under the add new form, I can go ahead and grab my 3Dubs design website design contract. Same logic applies here under the email to send. We're going to look at our smart field and highlight it in red. In this case, it's the job contract link. And again, by default, it's going to be included in the send contract email as long as you haven't messed with your default emails. If you pick a different email, make sure that this link appears in the body of your email. And again, if you don't have that link somewhere in your email, you can click smart field, link, and then contract link would be the way to add that back in there. Carmen's got another question. So if someone didn't fill out pre-questionnaire, can you automate another email with the form and vice versa to not send it if they already filled it out? Really good question, Carmen. So let's actually look at that real quick. I think that's a good idea to add into this. Let's go ahead and save what we've worked on. So right now, just to review, right, we already talked about setting a contract. We got all these settings correct. So make sure I didn't actually accidentally mess with any of these settings. I think we're good there. Cool. So to answer Carmen's question here, I know we've got a couple more questions. We'll get to you guys in just a second. So let's say that you send this intake form. It's the additional supplementary form that you want them to fill out, and you want to remind them to fill it out, right? Maybe after a couple of days if they haven't done it yet. We can go ahead and say add an action. We can go ahead and click the drop down. And again, we're just going to resend them that form. But the way we're going to do it is such that the system will be looking to see if they have or have not filled it out, right? So if I say send form. Now, before we get to this when setting, I just want to kind of jump down here to this form template to send to talk about one particular aspect that might kind of catch some of you guys. So you're like, okay, I already sent them that questionnaire. Now I want to send them essentially the same link. So is that going to be a problem since I've already sent it to them once? And to answer that question, if I click into this dropdown and I pick the exact same questionnaire, which in this case was the web design intake form, if I choose that option, again, it's the same form that I've already sent. You can see it right here behind the modal. It's not going to send them a new copy, because that would be really important, right? If they'd already kind of half filled it out and saved the draft but didn't finish it, it's going to send them the link to the exact same copy they already got, which is really nice in the case of forms. So we're going to make sure to pick the exact same form template. And then here under the when setting, this is where kind of the magic happens here. So let's say I want to remind them 3 days after I've first sent that form to go ahead and fill it out, right? I would click this up to 3 days. And then after that, we can go and click into our triggers. And now we can see here after form is not completed is this really perfect trigger for this scenario. So if I click that, now the system is going to say, great, what form do you want me to watch for completion? And we're going to tell it to watch for the completion of this website design intake form. Now, Carmen, to answer your question, this is how I would set that up essentially, right? If I go ahead and save this, let's apply it. I want to see it in kind of the flow here of this workflow. And keep in mind too, this might blow someone's mind here if you haven't tried this yet, but I can drag and drop workflow actions any way I like. So in this case, it doesn't matter where that action lies in the span of the workflow. I like to just organize my workflow from top to bottom in order because it's just easier to work with and look at. So that's why I dragged that action up there. But in theory, right, that action could take place anywhere, and it's only looking at if the form wasn't completed, so it will still fire. Anyways, the idea here is we're sending this intake form, and then this next action is going to wait 3 days to see if they have or haven't filled that form out, right? If 3 days go by and they haven't filled it out, it's going to send it to them again, right? Which is a really fantastic way to go ahead and remind them to fill that form out. Now, likewise, I could take that even a step further if I wanted to. Under this send contract here, again, I can't time it specifically looking at the appointment since that appointment is occurring outside the workflow, but I could get this a little bit closer to more specific if I wanted to. If I click edit, I could go ahead and say after a form is completed, which is kind of the corollary to that, right? I can say after the form is completed, I could tell it to watch for the design intake form if I wanted to. Now we know that this particular action is not going to get triggered at least until they filled that form out. Your discovery call may or may not have occurred by then if they've taken some time to fill it out, but at least this gets you closer to immediate. So just a little extra something on that. But Carmen, hopefully that answers your question. All right, Kevin asks, while you're on contracts, is there a way to do reminders for signing a contract? If not signed by X date, then send email, or if not signed within X days, send a reminder email. Great question, Kevin. Let's take a look at that as well. So that's actually going to not necessarily be in a workflow. You could definitely send emails in a workflow to send them the same contract link a couple of different times over the span of a couple of days. But if you wanted to do it more automatically, looking at a specific date, we're actually going to use the expiration setting on a contract. So as a little aside here, let's take a look at that real quick. Under templates and forms, let's go ahead and take a look at my contract. So this is my contract that I'm going to be sending. Now, if I go over here on the left-hand side under the form settings, I can see here under the general settings, I have an expiration date. So if I go ahead and say relative, I could pick a certain number of days before or after the project start or end dates. And I could also look at after the particular form has been applied to the project. So if you wanted to have a relative date, which means it's going to shift depending on these variables, you could use that. Or in the case of what Kevin was asking, if I wanted to be like, hey, I know I need this contract signed by November 1st, I would pick fixed. I would go ahead and open the calendar and I would say, fantastic, I need this to be done by November 1st. So that's when that form is going to expire. But if you see below here, I can see I have the ability to add reminders. So I go ahead and say add, I can remind my clients to go ahead and fill this form out. Maybe, let's do like 5 days before, right? So essentially the way this works is I'm picking an expiration date, either a relative or a fixed one. And then I can set up as many reminders as I like. I can keep adding these. I can have a ton of these if I want to, and set all these reminders up to look at before or after an expiration date, right? Well, it has to be before, but the idea being that as soon as this trigger hits, right? So 5 days before the first, it's going to send them an email reminding them, hey, your contract is expiring on X dates. Please go ahead and fill it out. And that email by default will include a link to that contract, Kevin. That would be the best way to go ahead and do that. And bear in mind too, let's say that somebody does let a contract expire and then like, actually, wait, I do want to sign that contract and I'd love to do it. They're not going to be able to do it unless you go ahead and adjust the setting, but you totally can. You can go into that particular form because it's not just for contracts. You could do this on any form. And you could unexpire the form. You could basically move that expiration date back or remove it entirely to allow that client to sign that form or complete the form again. Hopefully that helps to answer your question, Kevin. Take a sip of water here. I'm getting a little dry mouth. All right. I love all these questions, guys. Keep them coming. I appreciate it. Christy asked a question. So let's see here. What if you need to decide if they're a good fit for your services before they continue with the workflow? Is there a way to split actions based on approval? If they're not a good fit, what happens with the rest of the workflow, or would I need to separate workflows? Okay, good question, Christy. That's definitely getting into a bit more of like the intermediate, more complex kind of options in a workflow. But you definitely could figure out a way to split your workflows, or you could have it all in one. I've seen folks do that too, where it's like if a certain number of days pass after they don't fill out a form, for example, like let's say that somebody was a ghost and they just stopped doing stuff. Maybe you send an email that is like 30 days after a form is not completed. And it's kind of like a, hey, still interested? You could do something like that in one workflow. And if it's not a good fit, you could definitely have a separate workflow that you manually apply just to say like, you know what, like I appreciate your interest and maybe some kind of other trickle flow after that. But there's not going to be one kind of one size fits all answer to your question, Christy, but you definitely could do a split or you could have it all in one. The question really is think about what you are predicating that decision for yourself off of. Is it the discovery call? If it's just like a one-on-one interaction and it's not like the person is giving you an answer on a Dubsado questionnaire or something like that to predicate the answer off of, then it is just going to be a manual aspect where let's go back to the workflow and go back here. Let's say you have that discovery call if you're someone who's starting with the scheduler and a lead capture form and you decide yourself it's not a good fit. Well, we know that this contract's not going to get sent automatically because we haven't clicked approve, but maybe you have a secondary a secondary workflow. That is that kind of nurture flow for a not a good fit. At that point, you could just go into the project and apply that not a good fit workflow to let that run its course from there. And just know that you don't need to really touch the first workflow at all because it's never going to send that contract unless you click approve. Hopefully that helps, Christy. But again, it's going to be more specific to your particular process. If you have questions about your process, you're more than welcome to send me an email, and I'm happy to talk to you after this webinar. I can throw my email in the chat here as well if you like. Just Trevor at Dubsado for anybody who's watching this after the fact. Oops. That's not it. It's being weird. Oh, it thinks I'm trying to tag myself. Yeah, sorry. It's Trevor at Dubsado. If you're trying to send me an email, it's not letting me send my own email because it's thinks I'm adding somebody. Cool. Okay. Let's see here. We got a couple more questions. Kevin, cool. I'm glad that worked for you. And then, okay, cool, Christy. All right. Nikki. Sorry, someone already asked this. Got stuck on a call. No worries, Nikki, but will we be receiving a copy of this webinar? Oh, no one asked that already, but I always forget to mention it until somebody asks. If you're here right now and you are Nikki, then you'll automatically receive an email a couple hours after the webinar is done that it contains a recording. So everything you're seeing here right now is being recorded and it's going to be sent to you in an email just a couple hours afterwards. So you can catch up on the pieces that you missed while you're on your call. No worries, Nikki. Keep in mind too, folks, that you can always find our webinars on our YouTube channel as well. I post them usually that day or the day after, which can be a bit more convenient as opposed to going back to BigMarker to find it. So whatever your preference is. Okay. I think we got through all the questions there. Again, thank you folks so much for the really good questions. Those are all really relevant and fantastic questions. So let's go ahead and move on to our last example. Let's see, we're at 51 minutes. Yeah, cool. We're nailing the timing. So public proposal is the last one. So like I said, just to kind of review, There's 3 different places that people usually start their process. The first being just a lead capture form on the website, the simplest way to do it. Then you maybe go to a scheduler with a lead capture form, which is what we just talked about. Now, lastly, maybe you're somebody who has services that you want folks to be able to just sign up and buy right on your website. And the great use case for a public proposal would be that example right there, where you're going to go ahead and build out a proposal that you can then embed on your websites to just exist. And as soon as someone's like, hey, this service sounds perfect for me, they'll go ahead and pick their packages. They can go ahead and submit the form. And you're basically jumping straight into, now you have a new client. You have a new client who just purchased something on your websites. And now we have a workflow that can go ahead and nurture some of the actions you want to do after that flow happens. So let's go ahead and review. Let me go back to my form here. Under proposals, right? The proposal we were talking about just before in our scheduler flow was this one, right? Which is just my standard package proposal. It's just got my packages on here, a couple extra questions, and that's it, right? Nice and short. Keep in mind that if I wanted to have a public proposal, it's imperative that I add in a couple other things here. So let's go ahead and take a look at this public proposal by comparison. As you can see here at the top, I've got tell us about yourself, right? Same kind of logic as what we talked about before with the scheduler applies here. If this form exists on your website, that means that anybody on the internet can find your form and fill it out, which means we need to know who that person is, right? So we're going to go ahead and make sure to add in first name, last name, and email at minimum to make sure we're collecting that information from the clients. And we can go ahead and see it in Dubsado and okay, great, I've got John Smith just filled out my public proposal, right? And again, I've mapped these fields to client first name, client last name, and client email address. The system actually won't let you kind of proceed with saving your settings if you turn this to a public proposal and you don't at least have client email mapped, because it has to know who you're working with. I digress. So I want to make sure we have that on there. And then the rest of this is all the same, just the same packages and same questions. But I want to make sure that that was apparent. If you aren't clear on how to turn a proposal into a public proposal, that's kind of that's step 1, is making sure you have additional questions on there to collect the client information. Step 2, and the more important piece really, is under form settings. I can go down to public proposal options and I can toggle this setting to on, which is create new project once proposal is completed. If you're not really familiar with this concept of a public proposal, think about it this way. You've got your lead capture form and you have a proposal, and we just mash them together into one form. It's doing the jobs of both forms at the same time. It's collecting that lead, the information about that lead. And it's also a proposal. It's going to let them select packages and go ahead and generate an invoice effectively for them. So it's just taking those two things and smushing them together, right? The cool thing about a public proposal is that it also lets me go ahead and apply a default workflow. So the exact same thing that we talked about before is we're going to build this flow. You need to make sure to go back to your starting point, which in this case is the public proposal, and apply your workflow once you're done. In this case, you'd want to go pick your public proposal flow, whichever workflow you built out for this process. Same exact thing. We talked about it on all 3 of these. It's always the case, right? You build out your flow. Don't forget to connect it to your starting piece. Cool. That's our public proposal. Let's go ahead and head back to the workflow. So in workflows here, now we've got public proposal flow. Let's go ahead and click the gear icon. Now we're going to go ahead and actually, you know what? I goofed. I'm going to talk about one other thing here on this public proposal. So under the form settings, in this case, right, I also have the include contract and the include invoice option turned on. And I would say this is pretty common. I'd say most people who use public proposals are using it because it allows you to combine not only the lead capture form and your proposal into one document, it allows you to then tack on a contract and an invoice to your process. So you're really doing a lot of heavy lifting with a public proposal. If you're someone who's like, hey, I want bang for my buck, public proposals are where it's at. So they'll let you do so much stuff with just one piece of content, essentially, right? It's going to be able to automate you through that whole process there, just in one flow, one piece. And then you can have your workflow handle some things after that, which is what we're going to be doing. But just to make sure everyone's aware, right? Include contract, I've toggled that on. Lets me pick a contract. I also want to make sure that I have multiple packages selected if I want my clients to have the ability to select some add-ons, right? It's really great to upsell folks. And then lastly, under the invoice options, I want to make sure I include the invoice by toggling that on there. Really key piece here too, and this is not workflow related, but if I have this turned off, that does not mean that an invoice isn't getting generated. Bear in mind that whenever we're working with a proposal, that form type in Dubsado, an invoice is going to get created no matter what. Unless an invoice was already created, it's going to tack onto that existing invoice, but there has to be an invoice somewhere because those packages that the client selects have to have some place to get applied. So even if I have this turned off, an invoice is still going to get generated in the background. You've just elected not to show it to the client just yet. That's what this particular setting is talking about. If I say no, client doesn't see it yet, you could send it later on, obviously. If I say yes, the client will see it as part of that proposal contract invoice flow. Cool. I want to make sure that that was clear as well before we gloss over it. All right. So let's go back into our workflow here. And go to public proposal flow. Doing okay over here. Let's see. Okay, so in this case, since like I mentioned just now, this public proposal by itself is already handling a ton of automations for us. And if you were an attendee at our built-in automations, this is something that I think we talked about, right? Which is there's a lot of pieces of Dubsado that are built to save you time that aren't even workflows, which is fantastic, right? This workflow that we're going to build here is just kind of a little cherry on top to help you kind of keep track of things a little bit better. So in this case, we're going to do something that we already did before in one of our previous flows. We're going to say add action. We're going to go ahead and say change project status. Because in this case, I want to keep track of folks who have filled out that proposal and to see, let's make sure they filled out that contract as they're moving through, right? So we can go ahead and say status project. I want to see here under my jobs now, contract signed. So as soon as somebody signs that contract as part of the proposal contract invoice flow, their new project is going to be added to the contract signed flow. That's as simple as it needs to be, right? We want that to happen immediately. We're just changing the project status to contract signed. Then after that, maybe you want to keep track of whether or not they've paid that invoice in full, right? And this can be really relevant if you're somebody who has payment plans applied to your particular public proposal or your workflow for that matter, right? Maybe you want folks to pay deposits, but then you want to wait for them to actually pay you in full before you actually start giving your services out, right? So if we want to do something like that, we're going to do the exact same thing. We're going to say add action. We're going to say change project status. Again, we're leaving this at 0 days after our previous action is complete because, oh, I'm sorry. We're going to change this particular one to after invoice paid in full. There we go. And we're going to tell it to go to the invoice paid in full project status. So if I go ahead and apply that, let's review. The client is going to fill out the proposal, which creates a project. Then the workflow is kicking into gear and it's going to watch them to go ahead and sign that contract. As soon as they sign the contract, it's tossing them into that particular project status. And then maybe you're waiting a little while for them to go ahead and pay that invoice in full. Once they do pay in full, you want them to be added to the invoice paid in full project status. So this one's really more of like a, hey, we're just kind of keeping a bird's eye view on our projects as they move through this. Because now if I'm somebody who's like, I only want to render services once they pay in full, once they're in that status, you know, now we're good to go. I can start working with this client because they've paid me. That's kind of the concept here. So let's say that's once somebody does pay me in full, now I actually want to go ahead and schedule like a design session with them because I know that they're on board, right? They're working with me, they signed a contract and they paid. So now I would go ahead and add an action. Let's go ahead and say send appointment scheduler. And this time we can go ahead and pick maybe my design session right here. And as far as the trigger is concerned, this when setting, we can go ahead and time this for either after invoice paid in full. It could be the same trigger as above. It's a little bit redundant, but you could totally do that. Or we could even have after all previous actions completed if we want to, and that will work, right? This particular scheduler is not going to get sent until they pay in full, right? Because this, again, workflow is going from top to bottom. It's going to keep track of what they have or haven't done in this workflow just yet. So as soon as they actually check off this box and they are in the invoice paid in full category, then we want to send them that scheduler. So either one of those triggers would totally work. But this one, like I said, is simplistic because that public proposal is doing a ton of work for you, but now we have the ability to keep track of our projects. And I know we haven't gone to the projects page the entire webinar, but if you're new to Dubsado, this is what I'm talking about, right? I've created these project statuses here in my leads and jobs. If I look into these buckets, I can see really easily how many projects I have at each particular phase of my process. That's the concept here. And it sounds like some folks who were asking questions were aware of that. But for anybody who's brand new, I wanted to make sure that that was clear, right? I'm keeping track of when a project enters this invoice paid in full category, then I want to invite them to schedule an appointment with me. And that's what that workflow is doing. All right, Angel, another question. What if you send a proposal without an expiration and then decide you want to end it because they're taking too long to make a decision, for example? Can you end it? Great question, Angel. Yeah, totally. So let's go ahead and let's see if I have a project with a proposal right now. Let's take a look at Shelly. What do I have here in Shelly? Great, perfect. So really good example. I sent this proposal to Shelly, a fake client, right? I sent this proposal to Shelly 7 months ago. And if you were me, you'd probably be like, man, 7 months is a long time to make a decision. I'm going to give Shelly another week. Let's do that, right? She's got one more week to make a choice. If I go ahead and right now I'm in the forms tab of this particular project, since this is now specific to Shelly, right? This proposal that I sent her, this is just for Shelly. It's not changing anything for anybody else in Dubsado. I'm going to go ahead and say edit. And now the same thing that we talked about before applies. I can go to the form settings here and I can go ahead and go down to the expiration dates and I can choose a relative expiration date, which in this case might be a bit more complicated to figure out the timing on because it was sent so long ago. But you could easily do, looking at your project dates or after applied projects. I think in this case, though, if it was truly somebody who'd waited a really long time, I'd probably just pick a fixed expiration date. And I would go ahead and say, great, I'm giving Shelly one more week. I'm going to pick the 23rd, and it's expiring in 1 week now. In the same way right there, I could click add, and I could add some reminders to this. And then, right, I probably would tell Shelly if it was me and say, hey, just a heads up, the offer I sent you earlier is good for 1 more week. That way she's aware of it. But keep in mind too, we could use the reminders to do that if you wanted to, right? You could go ahead and just add a reminder and say 5 days, right? So in 2 days from now, she's going to go ahead and get an email that says her proposal expires in 5 days. There's a lot of different ways you can do it, but the same concepts apply there. Hopefully that answers your question there, Angel. All right. So I know that last one was pretty quick, but the idea being there is that using a public proposal is just a good way to automate a lot of things off the bat anyways. So we don't really need a super in-depth workflow for that one, unless you have a bunch of subsequent actions that you wanted to send there, right? And you, like I said at the very outset, we could all more actions into this workflow. Just keep in mind that let's say you're using these workflows with existing clients. If I go ahead and start adding actions here to my master workflow template, those changes aren't going to take effect for the clients who already have that workflow applied. So keep that in mind. It's going to take effect for anybody new who starts that flow. Angel says, awesome. Perfect. Another cool thing too, right? If you're somebody who wants to have multiple places for clients to start finding your process or for you to start bringing in new projects here, I could have all 3 of these different workflows active and ready to go simultaneously. There's nothing stopping me from having all 3 of these things out there. I could have a lead capture form on my contact page. I could have a scheduler on my book an appointment page. And I could have a public proposal on more of my salesy page that might also have more information about my services. I could have all 3 of these things happening all at the same time. And they all have their own workflow to kind of shepherd people through your process. I think that that's actually a really good option if you're someone who's like, I'm just getting going and I really want to start getting a high volume of clients. You're going to get a ton of new leads with having all 3 of these active. And the nice thing is these workflows took me less than an hour to set up, right? And I was able to start automating some of the follow-up pieces here. So I know with confidence that I could be asleep in my bed at night. Folks are finding my websites and I'm able to know that my system, Dubsado, is handling those first couple of actions for me automatically, which is exactly the point of Dubsado. All right. Christy has another question here. Is it possible to connect workflows or go from one workflow to another? Yes, Christy, it definitely is. So let's say let's just take a look at this public proposal. We're going to click the gear icon. Let's say that after somebody books this appointment, let's go ahead and click into here. So let's say after someone books an appointment, I want to start a different workflow. And what this concept, I call it daisy chaining, although there's no right or wrong terminology for it, but that's just the way I think about it, right? If I wanted to start a different workflow after something happens, I can go ahead and say, start a workflow. And in this case, right, maybe the when setting, if I was looking at this particular example, I only want to start this workflow after the client has booked that design session. I could go ahead and say after an appointment is scheduled. I could tell it to watch for that design session. And I could say, all right, great. Now I want to start, I have a bunch of other workflows in here. These are all other examples from a previous workflow. But let's say you had more of your booked flow that has a bunch of other actions in it. You could totally pick it here and go ahead, hold actions until booking flow, something like that. If I say apply, now the system will automatically kick that workflow into gear and apply it to the project once they book an appointment, right? So you can definitely chain these together just like that. And that's what a lot of folks do, right? Because having one really gigantic long workflow is totally fine, but it can be kind of hard to look at, right? You can be like, man, I'm scrolling through this. I need to drag this action here. It can be easier sometimes if you split your workflow into phases and have them connected that way, either automatically as we have in this example, or manually, right? You can always just be like, cool, I got to the end of that one. I'm going to apply a new workflow to go ahead and keep going with my process. Either one's totally fine. Christy, hopefully that answers your question. All right, folks, we're a little bit over an hour here, but I got through all 3 of the different examples that I wanted to talk to you all about. So if there's any questions that you have about what we talked about, to maybe more specific to your process, go ahead and throw them in the chat. And if not, that's totally okay. Keep in mind that we're always here to help you all. If you have questions while you're working on your workflows, do not hesitate to send us a chat here. You can click this little bubble right here and send us a message, and our customer care team will be happy to help you. All right. Like I said, you can also send me an email if you have questions specific to this webinar, Trevor at Dubsado. And it's been a pleasure, folks. I'll give it just another minute or 2 to make sure folks don't have more questions. But thank you for bearing with me. I know that talking about workflows can be a scary topic, but I don't want it to be scary for y'all. And I think hopefully this showed you that as long as you know where your process is starting, you can automate at least the first couple of things. And you're going to be like, man, why didn't I do this sooner? Because it didn't take very long and it's really helping you save time. And that's the exact purpose of Dubsado. Cool. Good, Sarah. I'm glad this was helpful. Really glad to hear that. Of course, Christy, happy to do it for you all. I love doing these. I love doing the lab demos because I think it's one of those things, especially with workflows, that seeing is believing. You're like, man, workflows, automation, it's too much. Like, as long as you just take it one piece at a time, don't overwhelm yourself, it's very doable. And I think everyone who's followed along here and has built something for themselves today is going to be very pleased with the result. So with that, we're going to go ahead and sign off for now. Like I said, there's going to be a recording sent out to anybody who is in attendance in just a couple of hours. And you can always find this on YouTube either later today or tomorrow. But otherwise, we will catch you on the very next webinar. Thank you all again for being here and have a great rest of your day. All right. Bye.